I'd like to first of all bring the warmest greetings from Unite Against Fascism, which is the main anti-racist, anti-fascist coalition in the United Kingdom, in Britain, and we've had an increasingly deep cooperation with the anti-fascist movement in Greece over the last two and a half years, beginning with the mobilisation on the 19th of January 2013, which was planned for that date, and 2 days beforehand Shehzad Lukman was murdered on the streets of Athens. But that mobilisation triggered, called initially Athens Anti-Fascist City, triggered copycat mobilisations around Europe, which we were very happy to be part of. 30 or more cities, London Anti-Fascist City, Derry Anti-Fascist City, St. Petersburg Anti-Fascist City, and so on. And from there, there's been a deepening cooperation March of last year and March of this year on the International Anti-Racist Day, coordinated demonstrations and so on. So we're extremely pleased to be supportive of the Jail Golden Dawn initiative and of the wider Greek anti-fascist movement. Now, why is the issue of Golden Dawn so significant to a British progressive public and indeed a European progressive public? Well, on one level, the sheer egregiousness, the sheer murderousness and the extent of the growth of Golden Dawn would be reason enough for anybody in Europe to be concerned. Nearly 10% at the European elections, the history of almost impunity of murders and attacks upon people, which we've heard about tonight. But it's more than that. And here I just want to make a point which I hope is not semantic. There is a Greek fascism. I mean, Dimitris started to explain some of the particularities of Golden Dawn, and I don't want to lose sight of those particularities. But I want to look at it from a slightly different point of view, of fascism in Greece. So not just a Greek fascism as a particular phenomenon, but fascism in Greece, because what we're facing in Europe is varied. There are different national political realities, different formations of the racist and populist right, all the way through to the explicitly neo-Nazi right in the form of Golden Dawn. But I want to argue that there is a common set of processes around Europe which mean that for those of us in the anti-fascist and anti-racist movement elsewhere, it's not just a question of the duty of solidarity to friends in Greece, it's also part of a struggle European-wide against the threat of racism, fascism and authoritarianism. And I want to try to outline what I think some of those processes are in Europe which are driving that forward. First of all, there's something of a journalistic commonplace now that if you have an economic crisis, then you have the far right. You know, it's like almost like the weather. Depression and economic depression is like a meteorological depression. You know, it comes in, and the result is the growth of the far right. Well, there's an element of truth in that, but I think what that does is exculpate all sorts of responsibilities in the society for the growth of the far right. That it's not automatic, that just because the stock market goes down, that the level of racial intolerance in the society must go up, that the level of racist murders must go up. People have to plan racist murders, people have to articulate racist policy. And that's what I want to try to address. It's not just that creating the circumstances of economic distress then allows for forms of scapegoating politics from the margins of society to gain a hearing. Something else has to happen as well, and it's happening inside Europe. And I want to outline a couple of these processes. First of all, when we talk about Europe and the movement of people within Europe, before the crisis, before 2008, we already had a situation where, as the borders within Europe came down, within the Schengen area, so higher and higher went the barbed wire around the continent. It almost became the condition for the free movement within the Schengen area that more and more Asian, Middle Eastern and African bodies must be sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean. What I mean is that this expansion of Europe, even in the good years, was predicated upon the exclusion of another. And so even before we had the conditions of blaming other people for the loss of jobs or welfare benefits but the welfare bill rising and so on, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, even before that we had conditioned into our continent a systematic racial exclusion, and upon that a racialization of politics, a racialization of society. Secondly, despite the fact people remember, you know, the dawn of the millennium and Schiller's Ode to Joy, Beethoven's Ninth. You remember, you know, the words "Alle Menschen werden Brüder," all men will be brothers. This was the promise of the European Union, of European integration from 2000 onwards. What we found, however, is national chauvinisms, not just from the fringes, but being articulated from the centre of European politics. I'll now just give you two examples at the onset of the crisis in 2008 through to 2010. In 2010, the then Finnish Prime Minister said, I quote, about the problem of state debt, public debt in the south of Europe, "We, Finns, are Protestants and we know how to pay our debts, unlike southern Europe, which is Catholic and Orthodox in the case of Greece." Now, this is the language of the religious wars of the 17th century, right? Being used by a mainstream politician in 21st century Europe. The front page of one of Austria's biggest selling tabloid newspapers 3 years ago had the front page, "Griechen raus," Greeks out. Right? It wasn't even just Greece out of the European Union, but Greeks out. There are tens of thousands of Greeks living in Vienna, and you don't have to be, you know, an editor of a German paper to know that Griechenraus is just one syllable away from Judenraus, which was the disgusting term which was percolated throughout Central Europe in the 1930s. What I'm saying is that the response to a crisis of legitimacy of all sorts of governments, the economic crisis, and so on, has been an increasingly radicalised and racialised public policy and politics in Europe. And it's in these conditions that the far right, in all sorts of forms, has been able to draw succour and to grow in a particular way which requires a particular response. There's one other element as well in terms of the more widespread racism and conditions which have facilitated the far right. And that's the specific question of Islamophobia, of a systematic racism directed against Muslims, largely Middle Eastern Muslims, and from the Indian subcontinent, here largely Pakistani. And the Islamophobia, as a concomitant of the war on terror, has a particular role, if you like, a particular function inside of Europe today. And it has connotations with the anti-Semitism of the 1920s and 30s. Because when you have this Islamophobic racism against Muslims, you have simultaneously the targeting of the Muslim within, as in anti-migrant racism and so on, and also the idea of the eternal Muslim without, who is a threat to Western values. Just as the way that anti-Semitism in the Nazi imagination was not simply about the exclusion of Jews within the borders of the Third Reich, but was the idea that there is a Jewish conspiracy to try and bring down the Aryan nation, to try and bring down Western civilization. And this is functionally how Islamophobia is projected often today. And so I want to conclude by saying that in raising these points, I'm trying to indicate that the question of Golden Dawn is not an aberration. Unfortunately, I don't think it's something which will simply go away or be attenuated if there's a recovery of the economy. I don't think it works like that. Marine Le Pen, and before her, her father, although perhaps they don't like to be called father and daughter even these days. You know, he doesn't want her to. He wants her to get married so she doesn't have the name Le Pen, apparently. But this began in 1983, not in the crisis years of 2008. There is something deeply structured into the way that the European order is not able to respond to, or is unwilling to respond to, the needs of people, the demands for greater democracy and so on, and is instead turning towards increasingly authoritarian forms of rule and anti-democratic practice. You know, if the people vote against a particular European piece of legislation or treaty, then to hell with the people, will hold the vote again, and so on. And this is very dangerous, because in the course of this happening, it already means that the systematic discrimination against minorities in Europe is increasing. The authoritarianism of states is increasing. We've just seen the French National Assembly pass a security law, a battalion of intrusive laws into people's lives, which has not been seen since the Committee of Public Safety and Robespierre, but with less reason than Robespierre had to pass that kind of legislation. This is happening across Europe, and it fuels the conditions for the growth of the far right and forces like Christian. And it's in those circumstances that all eyes of people in the anti-racist and anti-fascist movement in Europe are turned to Greece, not because we pathologise Greece, not because we think that Greece has a particular problem, but because we think that Greece is in the front line of a struggle that we're all embarked on in order to defend democracy and civil liberties across the continent.